The morning sun filtered softly through the swaying trees surrounding Willow Creek Nursing Home. From the outside, the facility looked peaceful, like the kind of place where time slowed down just enough to let the elderly rest in comfort. The red-bricked exterior was clean, the windows gleaming, and the gardens neatly trimmed. Caregivers smiled warmly as they guided residents in wheelchairs around the courtyard. It was the image of serenity. But images lie. Officer Adam Daniels stepped out of his patrol car and tightened Rex's harness. The German Shepherd barked once, alert and ready. Rex wasn't just a loyal partner, he was trained for scent detection, search and rescue, and tracking. Today, he was brought along, not for a manhunt or a missing child case, but something far more subtle. A routine inspection, at the request of social services. At least, that's what it was supposed to be. 3 anonymous tips had been submitted. Over the past month, each said something was not right inside Willow Creek. One claimed patients had been relocated without family notice. Another said the West Wing had rooms no one spoke about. The third was less specific, but more chilling. They hide more than just mistakes in that place. Daniels had seen his fair share of overblown rumors. But something about the timing, the consistency of the tips, and the strange silence from the administration triggered suspicion. He adjusted the badge on his chest and gave a short nod to the 2 investigators, waiting near the front entrance. Ready to go in? One of them asked. Daniels glanced down at Rex, who was already sniffing the air with sharp intent. Let's see what we find. Inside, the facility was quiet. Too quiet. The halls were spotless and smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant. A receptionist with a well-practiced smile greeted them and called the director, who arrived within minutes. Director Hartman, a tall man in a pressed gray suit, spoke confidently and without hesitation. He insisted they were welcome to inspect any part of the building, though he did mention that some areas of the West Wing are currently undergoing minor maintenance. Daniels took note of that. As they moved through the halls, Rex led the way, his nose twitching at every door and corner. Residents sat in communal areas, watching television or playing cards, mostly unaware of the officers. A few looked up with tired eyes, but no one spoke. The staff kept their distance, whispering among themselves. Everything looked normally at the silence behind the smiles made it feel like a show. When they reached the West Wing, Daniels noticed something odd. The lighting was dimmer. A plastic maintenance in progress sign hung on the wall. There was no sound of tools or work. Rex paused near a locked door, labeled Storage B, sniffed, then moved on. But, after only a few more steps, he stopped again, this time suddenly and with urgency. His body stiffened, head snapping back toward the previous door. Then he barked sharp and loud. Daniels turned immediately. "You got something, boy." Rex's claws scratched against the tile as he ran back to the storage room. He pawed at the bottom of the door and barked again, more aggressively this time. The other officers exchanged glances. "Is that a drug signal?" one asked. Daniels shook his head. "No, that's something else." He crouched beside Rex and examined the door. It didn't look unusual, but something about it felt off to clean compared to the dusty corners nearby. He stood up and turned to Director Hartman, who had followed them nervously. "What's in here?" Daniels asked. "Just old supplies. Mops, maybe a few sealed boxes. Nothing of interest." Daniels reached for the keyring clipped to his belt. "Mind if we take a look anyway?" Hartman hesitated just a beat too long before nodding. "Of course, be my guest." As the key clicked into the lock, a sudden hush fell over the hallway. Even the distant sound of the television in the common room seemed to fade. The officers readied themselves. Rex growled low, not out of fear but warning. The door opened slowly with a loud creak. The musty scent of stale air spilled into the hallway. What lay beyond was not a storage room, and it was only the beginning. The door creaked all the way open, revealing a cramped room barely larger than a janitor's closet. A single hanging bulb swayed slightly overhead, casting a weak glow over the cluttered space. Old cardboard boxes were stacked unevenly against the walls, labeled with fading black ink. Linens, medical kits, cleaning agents. Cobwebs danced in the corners, and a thin film of dust coated everything, untouched for what looked like years. But that wasn't what drew Daniels' attention. Rex ignored the boxes completely. His snout lifted, sniffing the air with short, sharp breaths, then lowered again as he walked straight to the back wall. He stopped, their head tilted, body tense, and let out a deep, steady growl. Daniels followed him with narrowed eyes. The wall was off, not damaged, not broken, just wrong. Unlike the other walls in the building, This one had no baseboard. The paint didn't match the rest of the room. It was slightly darker, almost as if it had been painted in a rush, and with different material. The corners weren't flush, and the way the light hit it, there was a barely noticeable bump running vertically down the right side, like a seam. Daniels ran his fingers along it. Hollow grabbed the thermal. He called out. One of the other officers handed over a compact thermal scanner. Daniels pointed it at the wall. The screen lit up with a faint heat signature cold on the surface. But behind it, there was an unusual void. A pocket of space that didn't match the official floor plan they had reviewed earlier. Hartman stepped forward nervously. It's probably just sealed off for repairs. Maybe an old maintenance shaft. Daniels gave him a look. A maintenance shaft with a sealed door behind a shelf and fresh paint. Hartman didn't reply. Rex barked sharply again, pawing at the lower part of the wall. Let's move these boxes, Daniels said. Together, the officers cleared the back of the room, behind the stacked boxes and an old rusted mop bucket. They found what they had suspected. A sliding shelf bolted into the floor and wall, custom fitted to hide a recessed panel. Daniel stepped back and exhaled. Someone really didn't want this scene. Using a pry bar from their equipment case, the team began working the edges of the panel. It resisted at first, but with a sharp crack, the false wall gave way. A gust of stale air rushed out as a narrow passageway appeared. It was barely wide enough for one person to walk through at a time, and completely dark beyond the first few feet. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling just past the threshold. But it didn't turn on when Daniels flicked the switch near the entrance. The bulb was dead or disconnected on purpose. He turned on his flashlight and pointed it into the darkness. The walls were plain, unpainted, and lined with thick dust. A set of shallow footprints, barely visible, trailed off into the shadows. Not fresh, but recent enough to suggest someone had come this way in the past few years. Stay here, Daniels told one of the officers. Call in backup. Get building plans from the city archives if you can. I want to know if this hallway was ever on the books. Then he looked down at Rex. Let's see where this goes, buddy. The dog didn't hesitate. With ears perked and body low, he stepped into the dark hallway. Daniels followed, his flashlight beam catching glimpses of exposed wires, cobwebs, and what looked like an old shoe half buried in dust. The corridor seemed to stretch on longer than the nursing home should physically allow. It twisted once, then opened up slightly and then finally, another door came into view. This one wasn't hidden, but it was locked. Solid wood, steel hinges, no windows, no markings. Daniels placed his hand on the doorknob. Cold. Rex sniffed at the base and let out a low whine. Daniels turned his head toward the hallway. Faintly, behind him, he could still hear the murmur of the nursing home staff and the muffled sound of a television in the common area. But in front of him there was nothing. Just silence, a locked door, and the sense that whatever they had found was not just forgotten, but deliberately buried. He stepped back, hand hovering over his radio. Something, he said into the mic. And it's not in any blueprint I've seen. The silence on the other end lasted just a second too long before a voice crackled in. Copy that. Do not proceed until backup arrives. Daniels nodded to himself, eyes fixed on the door. Behind it, he had a feeling, was the secret they weren't supposed to find, and the truth was just inches away. Officer Daniels stood silently in the darkened hallway, the locked door before him like a boundary between reality and something long buried. Rex sat beside him, alert but calm, his sharp eyes fixed ahead. The air was thick, stale with age, as if it hadn't moved in years. Dust floated in the flashlight beam like drifting snow. A voice crackled over the radio. Backup is 5 minutes out. You are cleared to secure the perimeter only. Do not breach until we arrive. Daniels acknowledged the message but didn't move. His fingers brushed the worn handle of the door again. Whoever built this had gone to great lengths to keep it sealed, not just physically, but off the record. No blueprints. No official records. No reason for it to be here. But it was. And Rex's instincts hadn't failed before. The silence was eerie. Not just quiet, but hollow. There was no buzzing from overhead lights. No hum from nearby rooms. Just the soft breathing of the canine officer at his side and the occasional crackle of dust settling behind them. Daniels knelt beside the door and examined the hinges. Rusted, but solid. He pulled out a small pry bar and tested the seam, careful not to make too much noise. If someone had been here recently, if someone was still behind this door, he didn't want to alert them just yet. Rex sniffed again and let out a soft whine. His body was tense, ears pinned back slightly, tail still. That wasn't a warning signal, it was concern. Confusion. Something on the other side didn't smell like decay or mold. It smelled human. Daniels stepped back. 2 other officers joined him moments later, their boots echoing softly through the hidden hallway. One of them, Officer Ramirez, looked unsettled. "This isn't on any plans," she said, holding up her tablet. "The hallway ends at a solid foundation wall. According to the official blueprints, this space doesn't exist." "Well," Daniels muttered, "we're standing in it." They positioned themselves on either side of the door. With a final nod from Daniels, Ramirez used a small hydraulic tool to apply pressure to the lock. It groaned under the force, then gave. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a room engulfed in shadows. Daniels raised his flashlight. The beam illuminated a small, square room, no more than 12 feet across. The air was still, almost frozen, and the floor was coated in layers of dust. But unlike the hallway, this room wasn't empty. A narrow hospital bed sat in the center, its thin mattress covered in an old, folded blanket. A wheeled bedside table stood nearby with a glass of water still half full. The walls were bare except for a few yellowed pages taped up with shaky handwriting and faded ink. Some kind of journal entries, perhaps messages written by hand. Rex didn't bark. He just moved slowly into the room, sniffing everything careful, almost respectful. Daniels followed, his light scanning every inch. There were signs of life lived in life. A pair of slippers under the bed, a cracked photo frame showing a younger woman and what looked like a dog. On the table beside the bed, an old paperback novel rested beneath a stack of envelopes. None had postage. Ramirez moved toward a corner where a tall cabinet stood closed. Inside, they found old hospital records, folded clothing, and a single journal with the name E. Whitmore written on the first page in blue ink. Daniels opened the cover and flipped through a few pages. Whoever stayed here, they were here for years. But how? Ramirez asked. How does someone live behind a wall without anyone knowing? Daniels looked around slowly, taking it all in. They didn't want anyone to know, he said quietly. They made sure of it. Suddenly, Rex's ears perked again. He moved to the far wall and sniffed at a narrow vent near the floor. It wasn't connected to the facility's main HVAC system. Someone had built a small, independent air system, just enough to keep someone alive. But hidden. This wasn't just a storage space, Daniels said. This was a cell. They stood in silence for a few moments. The weight of what they'd discovered was slowly settling on their shoulders. Whoever E. Whitmore was, she had been removed from the world deliberately, methodically, and with effort. The question wasn't just why she had been hidden, it was who had gone to such lengths to make sure no one ever found her, and what else might be waiting to be uncovered beyond this forgotten door. The silence inside the hidden room was unnerving, too deep, too deliberate. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the feeling that sound had been stripped from the space. Like voices were never meant to exist here. Officer Daniels slowly walked around the narrow bed, his flashlight beam tracing along the faded sheets. Dust clung to every surface. Yet, despite the years, everything was exactly in place, as if the person who once lived here had left in a single, quiet moment, never to return. He stopped at the table beside the bed. A small, glass cup sat next to a bottle of expired medication. The label was almost unreadable, but one word stood out. Whitmore. It matched the name in the journal. It matched the feeling they'd had from the moment Rex had barked at the false. While this wasn't an accident, this wasn't a forgotten wing or unused space. This was a room designed to be erased. Ramirez knelt by a filing crate near the foot of the bed and opened it gently. Inside were paper record scans of medical charts, handwritten notes, and printed memos from staff members, dated over a decade ago. Some were official, others scribbled quickly, as if someone had written them in a hurry, trying to document something they weren't supposed to. She looked up at Daniels. These aren't in the central system. I've never seen a facility keep patient files like this off record. Daniels didn't answer immediately. He was focused on the walls. There were faint scratches on the plaster near the head of the bed, barely visible unless the light hit them just right. He leaned in, words scratched carefully, repeatedly, into the wall. Still here. He turned away, jaw tight. Another officer entered the room, holding a tablet with the nursing home's digital archive. There's no mention of Eleanor Whitmore in the recent decade's records, he said. But get this, there is an admission form from 2008. She was transferred here from a psychiatric wing. admitted under the care of Director Hartman himself. Daniels straightened. And after that, nothing. No discharge, no recorded death, just gone. Rex let out a soft whimper and sniffed the floor near the vent. He pawed lightly at a loose board. Daniels moved over and pried it open. Hidden beneath was a sealed envelope, yellow with time. On the front, in elegant cursive, it read, "To whoever finds this, please, believe me." He opened it carefully, unfolding the delicate page inside. The letter was addressed to no one, but its voice was unmistakably human, tired, desperate, but clear. Eleanor described how she was brought into Willow Creek after a breakdown caused by grief. She admitted she had struggled, but not dangerously so. Her condition had improved. But instead of being allowed back into general care, she was moved to a private recovery space in secret. They told me I was too sensitive, that I asked too many questions. They said it would be temporary, but the door locked behind me, and no one came back. The letter ended with a plea. If I'm gone, please let someone know I was real. I was alive here, and I tried not to be forgotten. Ramirez covered her mouth. They kept her here like she didn't exist. Daniels nodded slowly. Because to them, she didn't. The weight of it sank in years of silence, of hidden truths buried behind a wall no one was supposed to check. This wasn't neglect. It was deliberate. They called forensics. Every inch of the hidden room would be photographed, every record catalogued. The walls themselves were now evidence. Before they left, Daniels took one last look around. He paused by the wall where the words "still here" had been scratched in. Then he turned and looked at Rex, who stood at the threshold, watching his partner with steady eyes. "You found her," Daniels said quietly. "You gave her voice back." Rex wagged his tail once, start, as the team exited the hidden hallway, back into the bright, polished corridors of Willow Creek. The contrast was staggering. Residents moved slowly under flickering lights. Staff members whispered behind clipped smiles. And the air seemed to hum again with ordinary life. But it wasn't ordinary anymore, because the truth had surfaced, and someone would have to answer for it. The next morning, the hidden room had been sealed off as a crime scene. Forensics moved in carefully, dressed in white suits, dusting for fingerprints and photographing every corner of the forgotten space. But Officer Daniels wasn't waiting for lab results. He was sitting at a long metal table in the evidence review room with a worn cloth-bound diary open in front of him. The name E. Whitmore was etched into the front cover with careful handwriting, almost like a child's school journal. The pages were delicate, some curling at the edges from moisture or age. There were no dates listed in the traditional sense, just small notes like Tuesday, rain again, or day 137. I think Eleanor Whitmore had tried to track time, but clearly even she had lost count eventually. Daniels turned to the first page. "They moved me last night. I don't know where I am now. They said this is a quieter space, better for my emotional safety, but the windows are gone. The air doesn't move. I haven't seen the sun in 2 days." He continued reading, flipping page after page. "I asked for my books. They said no. I asked for my radio. They said it's broken, but I can hear the halls through the vent when it's quiet. I think someone else used to live here. There's a mark on the wall by the bed, like a name was scratched out." Daniels paused. That explained the scratched letters they'd found beneath the layers of paint and plaster. There had been someone here before, Eleanor, maybe more than one. The entries shifted slowly over time. Her early frustration melted into a kind of resigned sadness. Some pages were just scribbles. Others were almost poetic, painted with memories and longing. "I remember the color of my mother's teacups. Pale blue, with a gold rim. I haven't thought about them in years. I dream about holding one again. Sometimes I wonder if anyone is looking for me. Maybe Sarah. She used to write me letters. She said she'd visit. She never did. But maybe she wasn't allowed." Daniels underlined that sentence with his pencil. He made a note beside it. "Trace Sarah Whitmore, possible family contact," by the middle of the journal. The handwriting changed, shakier, thinner. Some entries were almost illegible. "The nurse stopped coming last week. I think she's new. She doesn't talk. Just slides the food tray in like I'm not real. I leave the tray untouched sometimes just to see if she notices. She never does." There was anger in those pages too, but it was hidden under layers of heartbreak. "They call this care, but I've become a file number, a room, a silence. My name used to mean something. Now I only say it out loud to remember how it sounds." Daniels closed the diary for a moment and rubbed his eyes. This wasn't just a medical patient. This was a woman, a daughter, a sister, maybe. She had once had a life filled with love and small joys, and somehow she had ended up here walled off, lost in a place that promised healing. He reopened the last few pages, now fully focused. It's been months, or maybe years. I've started writing to someone who might read this one day. Maybe it's a nurse with a heart. Maybe it's a cop. Maybe someone who still believes people don't deserve to disappear. If you find this, sigh, forgive you, but please tell someone I was here. That line struck Daniels harder than anything else. He stood from the table and looked out the window of the evidence room. The nursing home stood in the distance, its peaceful brick walls now a symbol of something far less comforting. He had read reports. He had responded to welfare checks. But this was something else entirely. Daniels returned to his desk and opened the local registry system. He typed in the name Sarah Whitmore. One match appeared, a woman living less than an hour away, listed as next of kin for Eleanor Whitmore in a hospital form from 2007. No reported contact since. Daniels picked up the phone. He said to dispatch, I need a current contact number for Sarah Whitmore. I think she's been waiting for this call for a very long time. As he hung up, he looked back down at the diary. Eleanor had written her truth in the dark. Now, it was time to bring it into the light. Sarah Whitmore stared at the officer across from her, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Excuse me, she said quietly, clutching the arm of the sofa. Her living room was warm, the walls lined with photos, birthdays, beach trips, quiet holidays. But suddenly, the space felt unreal, like it didn't belong to this moment. Officer Daniels leaned forward gently, speaking with care. Your aunt, Eleanor Whitmore. She was never transferred to the state hospital in 2010, as you were told. We believe she remained inside Willow Creek Nursing Home, in a room that was intentionally concealed. Sarah's eyes brimmed with disbelief. Her breath caught in her throat, and her voice dropped to a whisper. That's not possible. They sent me a letter. They said she passed away. She stopped, staring at a framed picture on her bookshelf. I grieved her. Daniels reached into the folder in front of him and slid a plastic evidence bag across the table. Inside was a yellowing piece of paper, a letter, written in Eleanor's delicate cursive. To whoever finds this, please believe me. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, then slowly leaned in to read the letter. With each word, her body stiffened, and by the end, tears streamed silently down her face. She pressed her palm against the bag as though trying to touch the woman who had written it. I thought she was gone, Sarah said at last. We tried for years to keep in touch. We wrote letters, called the facility. But after 2010, they told us she wasn't there anymore. I drove down once, demanding answers. They said she had been moved due to her condition. When I asked for details, they gave me a number that never answered. And then ... A few months later, I got a sympathy card. No explanation. Just a note saying she had passed. Daniels listened quietly. He had heard stories like this before. Families pushed aside, with vague words and dead-end paperwork. But this was different. Eleanor had been hidden, not lost. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she picked up a small worn photo from the side. Tibble, this was her. This is how I remember hers. Smiling, stubborn, reading books she thought were too complicated for the rest of us. She used to say her mind was a library no one had finished exploring. Daniels smiled faintly. That sounds like the woman we read in the diary. Sarah looked up. You have her diary. We do. Every page. She wrote to you, often. She never forgot you. She wondered if you were still looking. Sarah nodded slowly. I was. She walked over to a drawer and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a postcard, faded, creased at the corners. She handed it to Daniels. On the front was a photo of a lighthouse at dusk. On the back, in barely legible handwriting, were two simple words. Still here. There was no return address. Sarah said. No signature. It arrived in 2013. I didn't understand it. I thought it was a mistake, maybe someone else's message. Daniels studied the card and then looked at Sarah. I think she found a way to send it. Maybe someone sympathetic on staff. Maybe a moment when no one was watching. But she was trying to tell you. Sarah held the postcard in both hands, like it was made of glass. She never gave up. Even when the world stopped looking for her, she didn't give up. Daniels stood and handed her a copy of the current report. There will be hearings, investigations, maybe even criminal charges against former staff members. But before any of that happens, I wanted you to know, you mattered to her. You kept her human, even in that room. Sarah looked at the officer, eyes red but steady. And now, maybe I can give her that in return. She walked to the fireplace and placed Eleanor's photo, the postcard, and the letter beside one another. Then, she lit a single white candle dot as the flame danced. It cast a soft light across Eleanor's face. She had been hidden, but not forgotten. Within 48 hours of the discovery, the story broke across every major news outlet in the region. Headlines flashed in bold letters: "Hidden room in nursing home reveals forgotten patient." Images of the narrow passage, the concealed door, and the weathered journal appeared alongside quotes from shocked officials. For most, it was difficult to believe this had happened in a registered healthcare facility in a quiet suburban town. But for Officer Daniels, it wasn't about headlines, it was about truth. And finally, the truth was no longer locked behind drywall and silence. A full investigation was launched by the state's Department of Health. Internal documents from Willow Creek were seized. Archived emails, medical logs, and staff schedules from a decade ago were pulled from cold storage and reviewed line by line. Patterns began to emerge. 3 former administrators had signed off on unusual patient transfers between 2009 and 2014. Several names like Eleanor Whitmore appeared in outdated paper records but were missing from digital systems. When Daniels compared those names to the official state database, he found discrepancies. Some of those individuals had been marked as deceased, yet their death certificates were vague, signed off by private contractors who had since disappeared. What we're looking at, one investigator said during a debriefing, is not just negligence. This was a system designed to erase people. Director Hartman, who had once greeted Daniels at the entrance with a confident smile, was now the subject of a criminal probe. He denied knowledge of the hidden room, insisting he had inherited an outdated facility with unusual blueprints. But under pressure, former employees began to speak. A retired nurse came forward anonymously, voice trembling in her interview. "We weren't allowed to ask questions. If someone was labeled non-compliant or difficult, they just disappeared. They said it was a special care protocol, and we weren't supposed to talk about it." Another former orderly described a meeting where staff were told to avoid discussing certain patients, especially with families. "We were told it was a liability issue," he admitted, "but we all knew something wasn't right." Eleanor's diary, the sealed room, and the forged transfer papers were undeniable evidence. The case quickly escalated beyond local law enforcement. Federal health officials and patient rights groups became involved. Protesters gathered outside Willow Creek, demanding justice not only for Eleanor, but for every name that had vanished from the system. Sarah Whitmore spoke publicly at a press conference, holding her aunt's journal in both hands. "She wasn't invisible," Sarah said. "They tried to silence her, but she wrote her way back into the world. This place robbed her of time, of light, of voice, but not of dignity. I want to know how many others were hidden. I want accountability. And I want people to care before this happens again." The crowd stood in silence as she finished, and then erupted into applause, not for the tragedy, but for the courage it took to bring it to light. In the weeks that followed, the state ordered a full shutdown of Willow Creek Nursing Home. Residents were relocated to licensed, closely monitored facilities. Staff underwent recertification and psychological evaluations. The building itself was locked and marked with red tape, soon to be the site of deeper investigation. But something more powerful than policies had shifted. Conversations about elder care, mental health treatment, and facility oversight sparked. Across the country, news shows invited experts to explain how cases like Eleanor's could happen, and how to prevent them. Families began demanding full access to medical records. Whistleblower protections for caregivers were strengthened statewide. Officer Daniels was asked to speak at a healthcare ethics panel. He didn't say much, just read one of Eleanor's diary entries aloud. The room was silent as he finished. "If you find this, I forgive you. But please tell someone I was here." He looked out across the audience, then folded the page and walked off stage. He didn't need to say more. The truth had been spoken, and this time, everyone was listening. 3 months later, the Willow Creek Nursing Home was quiet for the first time in decades, not with secrecy, but with finality. The windows were boarded, the doors locked, and the property now stood under court supervision. A thin wire fence wrapped around the building, not to keep people in, but to ensure that no one ever again forgot what had happened inside. The investigation had reached its peak. 2 former administrators, including the retired Director Hartman, were charged with multiple counts of medical fraud. falsifying records, and unlawful confinement of a patient. A third staff member accepted a plea deal in exchange for testimony, revealing key details of how patients like Eleanor Whitmore were relocated quietly and removed from the system. It was the kind of scandal that made state headlines for weeks, but for the families, it was more than news. It was the restoration of truth. For Sarah Whitmore, justice had always felt like an abstract idea, something people chased when there were lawyers and headlines involved. But standing at the edge of the memorial garden dedicated to Eleanor, justice felt different, real, personal, soft. The memorial garden had been built in the very courtyard Eleanor should have had access to, right outside the West Wing, just steps from the room where she had been hidden. Volunteers from the community, former patients, families, and even some of the newly assigned healthcare officials had come together to build it. Clean stone paths, benches with engraved names, and lavender bushes lined the walkways. In the center stood a white stone plaque that simply read, "In memory of those whose voices were lost, and to those who helped them speak again." Beneath it, in smaller letters, Eleanor Whitmore, 1943 unknown, still here. Officer Daniels stood nearby with Rex sitting patiently at his side, wearing a black service vest with a silver emblem that now read Commendation of Honor, Public Discovery. Rex had become a quiet hero, his image shared across social media, his alertness praised in interviews. But Daniels knew the dog didn't care about medals. Rex had followed his instinct. The rest had followed Eleanor's words. As people gathered around the memorial for a small dedication service, Sarah stepped forward. In her hands, she carried Eleanor's journal, now restored, sealed in archival plastic, and protected in a wooden case. Her voice trembled only slightly as she addressed the crowd. "My aunt didn't get to grow old the way she deserved. She didn't get family holidays or birthdays or time in the sun. But she left something behind. She left truth. She left words that helped her be found." She paused, then looked at the crowd with a small, grateful smile. "And today, we're not here because of what was taken from her. We're here because her story didn't end in that room. It came back to life." After a quiet moment of silence, she placed the journal beneath the plaque in a sealed memorial box, alongside a copy of the letter Eleanor had written to "Whoever finds this." Daniels placed a single rose beside it. "She was found," he said quietly, as the ceremony ended and the guests began to drift away. Sarah remained seated on one of the benches, watching the light filter through the garden leaves. Daniels sat beside her, Rex laying down at their feet. "You think people will remember?" she asked. Daniels nodded. "They already are." She smiled faintly, then looked out toward the closed doors of the old building. "It's strange. I used to picture her there, all those years sitting in a common room, watching TV, maybe bored, but safe. I never imagined a hidden door, or silence behind a wall." "No one did," Daniels replied. "That's why we have to talk about it now." The wind moved gently through the trees, and a bird called out in the distance. For the first time, the place didn't feel like a graveyard of secrets. It felt like a beginning. A space reclaimed not just for Eleanor, but for everyone who might have been forgotten. And somewhere in that stillness, it felt like her words echoed again. Still, here, not in sorrow, but in remembrance.